All right, Chris, here we are with our inaugural episode of the Fantasy Elect podcast, TBD, what we'll end up calling it in the future. I guess we should start with some introductions. I think, Chris, introduce yourself first. I think you're you're the most experienced political one of between us, obviously. So, share a little bit. How do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I had I always say the good misfortune of getting involved in politics right out of college. I was a film major, and over the past 40 some years, I have done uh, well over 400 campaigns, including 7 governors, 11 U.S. senators, and I've worked on 7 major presidential and probably about 3 or 4 other guys that never got off the launching pad. And it's been a interesting career, and one of the things that intrigues me about Fantasy Elect is I'm not going to use the word bitterness, but everybody thinks they're an expert, and cable TV made everybody an expert in politics, and Twitter made everybody a super expert in politics. Um, and I think that just like sports betting has exploded, Fantasy Elect taking that sports betting mentality and taking it over to politics is also going to explode because the great part about sports betting and the lure of it and why it's interesting and why it's fun to do is that are you as good as the experts? Are you smarter than everybody else?
Yeah.
And everybody on Twitter or on Facebook thinks they are, but this is the way for them to prove it. And that's really intriguing. In a lot of ways, it is the democratizing of the consulting business.
Oh, that's a really I think that's the best pitch yet. I pitched last night at an event and I think that's the that's I'm gonna steal that.
Yeah, you're my
Um
guest.
no, that's a great. I mean, you and I we met maybe 6 or 7 years ago now, and I
Mhm.
remember the first time we met going in your office and not even really knowing like what you did, right? And
Mhm.
going into your office and then seeing I want to say that it was Arlen Specter, maybe a poster in your office, and it I follow politics,
Mhm.
and we had this great conversation, and I just love the inside baseball version of it. What I love about that is that it looks at it in some ways at a deeper level of politics, the way it really is, not the way people think it is, but the way it really is. Um, and that was, when I came back from Vietnam and I started this company, I thought right away that experience and you were like, okay, this is someone who can accelerate and bring that ethos into what we're trying to do. So I 100% agree. I would just say that for myself, I've bounced around a lot, and I actually did not know that you started with film. I don't think we ever talked about that, but I tried my hand at film for a while. I wrote some things, created a comic book, did a lot of different things. When you and I met, I was doing real estate
Mhm.
development, um, and then had this idea while playing fantasy football with friends when Donald Trump entered the race in 2015, and just kind of looked around and realized, man, this is like a sport right now. These rallies, it feels like we're at a football game, and saying to someone, this is the game we should be playing.
Right.
And that lightning moment, I actually did put a pitch deck together and I sent it to a tech guy that I knew. And he said, that's great. You should do it. And I said, I don't know anything about tech. So I didn't do anything with it and went and had a failed vacation in Vietnam for 4 years, supposed to be a vacation turned into a lifestyle. Um,
Sounds pretty good to me.
but when
Right.
I came back, yeah, it was great, but I was ready for something more. So coming back to the States, ending up here in Austin, and then pitching the idea at an event just as a whim has now taken on its own life. So that's the background. That's kind of our bio as individuals and as the company. So that's amazing. So you actually did touch on something that wasn't originally going to be something that we talked about, wasn't planned out, but you were talking about cable TV. and now everyone thinks they are, they know everything. Are you getting this feeling? I get this feeling now that politics and cable TV are almost the same thing. That 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 there's a desire or a job description that in some ways makes being almost a talking head on cable TV another part of your job as a senator or as a congressman or as any other, choose your political position. Am I wrong in that, or is that, am I picking up on something wrong?
No, I mean, actually, what you have, like most things in politics, it's incredibly nuanced. And some of the most popular politicians in America are the ones that are never on cable TV, and are never in the news. And they're just kind of grinding away doing their job. And I think that, I'm trying to think the best way to put it without pissing on everybody. Cable TV is simply a tool. It is if you work in the political consulting business, if you work in campaigns, and like I do, cable TV is basically a tool. It is a tool to get a message out. It is not more than that. There are a number of elected officials who it's pretty clear really hate being a congressman, really hate being a senator, but they really like being on cable TV. And I think that is it's a double-edged sword, and a lot of it depends on the market. It depends on the personality of the elected official. The other thing that's kind of interesting on cable TV, and here I'll be really catty, and I've got a bunch of good friends that do a lot of cable, like Mike Murphy and Alex Castellanos, and there are a lot of people on cable TV, and I'll come up as Democrat consultant or Republican consultant, and we all go, who? And it's people that have never worked on a campaign or have worked at a committee or were working in the law firm that was running some, and they're kind of 5 places removed. And, they're, the old joke about you're not a real consultant until you've won 2 major campaigns and then gotten your brains kicked in 3 more. And that's when you're a major consultant. But these are people that don't have a resume to talk as authoritatively as they are, which brings us back to Fantasy Elect, because everybody out there has the same base of knowledge that the so-called experts on cable have, but what the people out there that would play Fantasy Elect, they have a better grasp on reality, because they're not looking for the next soundbite. They're going to try to figure out who is going to win. And if you're going to figure out how somebody is going to win, part of that intellectual process is figuring out the why they're going to win. And that is one of the parts that I'm excited about, because I think it will give people a deeper understanding in politics. There's a wonderful line that the difference between art and politics. In art, you go for a greater truth, and in politics, you work for an achievable end, knowing that it's going to be ugly and muddy and brutal, and your side is going to be sometimes just as bad as the other side. I have a poster back, which maybe you can see, maybe you can't see. It's for Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the spy movie. And a lot of the stuff, if you talk about spy things during the Cold War, there was a lot of brutality on both sides. And in the movie, the Gary Oldman character gives a lovely speech. He says, it's about time that your side is just as worthless as my own. And it's a little kind of nihilistic, and I don't think that. But again, that knowing why campaigns win and candidates lose. And Jeff Greenfield, who is one of the smartest commentators on American politics in the last half century, had a wonderful line, and he said, "If you did nothing else but bet against conventional wisdom in politics, you would become enormously wealthy."
Wow.
And he's absolutely right, because, and I'll go back at the beginning of my career, nobody ever would have thought Jimmy Carter, a inconsequential governor from Georgia, was going to beat the entire Democratic establishment after Watergate and become president. And
Mm.
nobody thought that a kind of washed up movie actor, right winger named Reagan, was going to be the electoral giant of the late 20th century.
Mm.
Nobody thought a pudgy philanderer, ethically challenged Bill Clinton was going to beat the hero president of the Gulf War. And nobody thought that a unknown state senator from Illinois was going to defeat Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. I mean, you can go on and on. I mean, and you can go to Donald Trump. And even if you look at 2020, the betting odds you could have gotten on Joe Biden right before the Iowa caucuses would have made you enormously wealthy. And that goes to that the experts don't know anything, but people are pretty smart. And with all those choices that were made by Vox Populi, by the general public, they were all incredibly logical, and they kind of seem inevitable in retrospect.
Mm.
But again,
Mm-hmm.
there's an entire industry out there that it points out the obvious on cable TV or in blogs or newspapers or even podcasts. But again, if you're what we call a normie, if you're a normie out there, you should really relish the chance to lock horns with the so-called experts and see if you're smarter than they are.
And to your point, you know, the way you phrase it, betting against conventional wisdom is going to make you a ton of money.
Mm-hmm.
You know, drafting teams against what's expected may be the path to winning the pot, right? I mean,
Yep.
putting together a really smart team of challengers that are going to earn more fantasy points in the game that we've set up than having an incumbent that isn't going to earn you as many points, but may win, has a high likelihood of winning. In our political process, the incumbents are heavily favored. That strategy could be the path to ultimately winning. So again, it does go directly to the game as well. How do you put together the knowledge that you have around the country in these different positions to maximize those fantasy points, even if they don't necessarily win their race, but you can maximize your points.
Right.
So it's actually it is a great analogy even for our game. The game is so meta in a way. It's like a reflection of the world we're living in. It's really interesting. So to that point, I think the first where we could start today is let's do a bit of a recap on the bellwether. I mean, it's a bellwether year for a reason, right? It's supposed to be kind of an indicator of what we think is going to happen in 24. But before looking at 24, what happened in the 4 states last week on November 7th? Kentucky, Virginia, New Jersey, Mississippi. Any big surprises in performance that you maybe didn't expect, or any performances that you thought you did expect and that panned out, and that says something?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that no, but, and I'm going to do that both ways. What was interesting is that overwhelmingly people voted for normies. People voted for somebody normal. Let's start with Virginia, because that's been talked about a lot. That Virginia, the Republicans are trying to take over the legislative houses in Virginia and fail. And it's kind of considered, it was kind of considered a failure for Glenn Youngkin. At the same time, those Republican candidates overperformed 20 and 22, and from the base Republican vote. And so basically, those Republican candidates, while not all of them win, most of them were close. And it was a Republican electorate kind of coming back to normal because Trump wasn't there. And weighing on the other side of that was abortion, where, basically
Mm.
voters said, the governor of Virginia, Youngkin, kind of put forth a abortion idea that was 15 months was going to be the limits of abortion, which would put the U.S. in line with, I think, France and, and it's a lot of Western Europe. It's not an onerous thing. But what voters said, especially women and suburban women, they said, you know what? We don't trust you because you put in the Supreme Court that took it away. And we see some of these restrictive states that are, like Alabama have really strong restrictions and, a couple of the others. And so we don't trust you. And, F you, we're going to punish you for that. And that's going to continue until Republicans figure out a way to solve that. And it's solvable, but it means, people have to become reality based and kind of talk to voters where they live. I'm one of the things about being old and having done this for about a million years is that Republicans got slaughtered in 1989 on abortion in Virginia, in New Jersey, and in a bunch of states. And they had to come up with a solution to it, and they did. A political solution to a problem, an electoral problem. And that's kind of how this is going to work out as well, or else Republicans will keep losing. And one of the things we know about politicians is that, the number one goal is to win. And I hate if that's going to burst anybody's illusions about why people are in politics, but politics is about power and politics is about winning. If for no other reason is the simple thing is all the things that you might want to do legislatively and all the good you might do not happen if you are a backbencher and in a minority. So number one thing is to win. So that's Virginia. So Virginia's kind of I'm going to put that as the aside case because it was a Republican failure, but it was a really interesting one. I think if you want to use the sports analogy, think of it as the team that became a wild card team. And they thought they were ready to make the jump into the playoffs, but not. They had a struggle for a wild card and they got knocked out in the wild card game. That was Virginia Republicans.
What does that mean for Youngkin specifically? Did that weaken him? There was talk that he had presidential aspirations. I'm interested to hear what you think about this, but I think in the current field, I don't know that there's any appetite among any Republicans to jump in for 2024 right now.
Yeah.
But does that weaken Youngkin for at least if not this cycle, the next cycle for presidential aspirations?
No.
Or is it too early to know?
It doesn't weaken him because it wasn't a wipeout. If it's a wipeout, people will go, And also the short-term memory. If I don't think he's going to jump in this cycle unless Trump has a heart attack and goes, face down on the 16th tee. But going forward, Youngkin will say, I've been a successful governor of a southern state. And more importantly, I'm a self-funder. I can write a check for $100 million, which immediately makes him viable. And if you're an opponent, good luck litigating what happened in Virginia 17 legislative district as a negative. So no, I don't think it helps. It doesn't help him, but long term, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant.
It more so doesn't help him just, I guess, at the state level, right? He won't be able to pass his agenda for the rest of his term.
Or it could really help him because what happens.
That's right.
Because he can, if he figures out a way to get half a loaf or 3/4 of a loaf by compromising with Democrats to a national electorate in 2028, that is going to be very appealing. I was a guy who got all this shit done by working across aisles with parties. That is a really compelling message. And we saw that
especially
message.
because he already has his conservative bona fides, right? So
Right,
at
right,
a primary level, there's no doubt that he's conservative, right? And then
right.
to be able to actually show getting things done that moderates him, if that gets him, that does well for him in a general where he might need to tack to the middle a bit more, right?
Yeah, and who that really helped jumping to Kentucky was Andy Beshear, who was a Kentucky Democrat, um, kind of in the Youngkin moderate to, moderate. Yeah, if Youngkin's moderate to conservative, Beshear is moderate to liberal. And he was running against the African American Republican Attorney General, who was very well thought of, and he kicked his ass. And the basis for the Beshear campaign is that I am nonpartisan. I work across the aisles. And he actually ran commercials with voters saying, I voted for Trump in 2020, and this year I'm voting for Andy Beshear. That didn't get any notice in the national press. But I was doing the Secretary of State down there, a guy named Michael Adams, who was the highest vote getter in the state, who was probably the up and coming politician in the state of Kentucky is Michael Adams. And the way he's done that is by being bipartisan. And there was there have been a bunch of cross pressures with both voting access and voter suppression and its kissing cousin voter fraud. And Adams kind of pioneered the mantra is that I'm going to make it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And did. And what he did when it started out was very controversial. But Michael Adams is one of those guys that has never taken a stupid breath in his life. And he came up with a bipartisan plan that was endorsed by the Kentucky NAACP and the governor, and it passed the very conservative Republican House and Senate, and he made it easier to vote and harder to cheat. And voters rewarded him by making him the highest vote getter in the election. And it wasn't even close.
Wow.
He ran like over 10 points ahead of the top of the ticket, which is impressive. But again, voters rewarded people that could actually do shit and that were smart. And so, what's interesting is if you're drafting a fantasy team, a relatively colorless governor that you probably have heard nothing about, like Andy Beshear, would be a big win by the metrics, because by any account, I mean, Kentucky is a state that Joe Biden lost by almost 30. And this guy won it by almost 10. And so,
right.
So again, I mean, you kind of that's the way you want to bet. I mean, and again, and I think that's the kind of, the interest that I think a lot of the national media doesn't catch on to. But if you look at it like you would look at it, look at the NFL this coming week, you would take a look at Jacksonville and you say, well, they got slaughtered by San Francisco, but I think you can do that kind of thing. And so, that was really interesting. Louisiana went Republican, which wasn't a surprise. But what was a big surprise was how close it was. And I think that the other thing to look at going forward in elections, and this is also, by the way, true in New Jersey. New Jersey, the Republicans got closer in the state legislature, but they didn't achieve what they were supposed to do because money mattered. And in New Jersey legislative races, Republicans were outspent, I don't know, in a lot of races, 10-1. And it's very difficult to win. In Kentucky, the Democrat, who was a very good candidate, outspent the Republican, I want to say 1.5-1. And so money matters. And one of the interesting, you tend to think of Republicans as the, traditionally the big business candidate and the corporate PACs and the Koch brothers and whatever else you have. But the fact of the matter is that every presidential election since 2004, Democrats have outspent Republicans at the presidential level. for almost 20 years. And Biden will outspend Trump by about $1 billion, not million, $1 billion this coming cycle. And again, it's it's like picking a basketball team, picking a sports drafting a basketball team, and you're looking for a lot of 3-point shooters. Well, money's the 3-point shooters.
That's a really good point, especially, I mean, one of our scoring metrics, as you know, is fundraising, right? So we actually, we assign points based on fundraising. Because he who raises the most money has a higher likelihood of winning. So
Yep.
that is a clear indicator of how you are performing in the race. So to your point, I guess as I look at who won and who's spending money, I don't want to jump ahead too much, but there are some really interesting questions about money's not unlimited. And there are some there are some strategic places where the National Party is going to have to put its money in 2024. What do we know from where the National Party put its money in 23 that gives us an indicator of where they want to line up and fight? Is it in protecting some weak seats? Is it, my understanding, I'm looking at a couple of places, and right off the top of my head, where money didn't necessarily help last cycle was Tim Ryan and J.D. Vance in Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
right? There a lot of money went into that race.
Yeah.
But Ohio was a tough one to win for, interestingly enough, tough for like a native son of Ohio that was, a known commodity versus J.D. Vance, who was a novice to politics, right? So maybe that played in his favor. Where did the national money, where did it flow in 23 that maybe surprised you, or that some takeaways for, as we're looking ahead to games in the future, we might be able to say, oh, these people are going to be staunch raisers?
Yeah, I think the two surprises to me was how much money Presley, the Democrat in Mississippi, I mean, this is, again, another state that Joe Biden lost by 30 plus points. How much money, national money, he got, and got very close to, I think, got 47 against the incumbent Republican governor. And I think that amount of money was interesting. And I think the money spent in New Jersey legislative races was astounding. Like a little state Senate race in South Jersey, the total spend on it was, well over like almost $2 million, which is staggering for, a job that pays, $100,000 a year. But I think that going forward, I think something to look at is how Democrats raise money, because they can take races that might not be competitive and make them competitive by the spend. They can also do is spend money in places that will make Republicans not try to gain seats, but try to lose seats. I mean, one of the famous, and there's miscalculations on it, which is kind of the really fun part of this. If you look back, I guess it was in the 1820 cycle, the 20 cycle, Mitch McConnell against Amy McGrath. Amy McGrath raised over $100 million, staggering amount of money. She got fucking slaughtered. McConnell gutted her like a fish, and the race wasn't particularly close. And if you look around the country, the money that was pissed away on her could have been spent winning races in other places. Where money was well spent was in Georgia, where, Ralph Warnock beat Herschel Walker in a very close race. But he also outspent Walker 2-1. I mean, he spent over $100 million. So that was money well spent because you picked up a seat. So, I think that there was, wasn't Yellen, was it Summers who used the phrase irrational exuberance to describe the stock market?
Yeah, it was Greenspan.
And I think Democrats have irrational exuberance One of the great scams in American politics is to become the consultant, for a campaign running against Nancy Pelosi or Mitch McConnell, because you're not
Right.
going to win, but you're going to raise a lot of money, which means you're going to make a lot of money. And
Right.
expectations are kind of low. And
Mm.
you always find that. I mean, the guy 2 cycles ago that ran against AOC, raised like $6 million or something in a race that has no shot at winning. But you do a direct mail fundraiser and say, I'm
Right.
running against AOC, socialist and communist, and the same thing. I mean, Amy McGrath had the easiest fundraising of all time. All she had to do was write out to Democratic activists, I'm running against Mitch McConnell. And people were like, we're not write the check.
Hmm.
Um, and so those things are
Yeah.
interesting. I'll tell you what I think probably one of the most interesting races coming up is going to be in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, where
Oh.
Bob Casey is a incumbent. He's the senior senator in Pennsylvania. I think this is his. I want to say this is his fourth term coming up, and he's running against a guy named Dave McCormick, who is originally from Pennsylvania but lived in Connecticut most of his adult life. McCormick lost the primary to Dr. Oz, who then went on to, lose to hoodie short wearing John Fetterman,
Yeah.
the general. And, both sides are going to spend $100 million on the race.
Mm.
And it's going to be interesting. There's a lot of really interesting game theory about it. And, if I was placing odds on that, I'd probably place it. I think the betting line, if you had a Vegas line on that race, and I'm sure Vegas will have a line on that race, they're probably doing 3-2 for Casey. I think the odds for that are a lot different because I think the state Pennsylvania has changed, and I think Pennsylvania is no longer a swing state. I think it's a
Oh,
Democratic.
interesting.
I think it's a Democratic state.
Solidly Democrat.
Yeah, I think so. And
Oh,
what makes me
interesting.
say that is if you look at judicial races, where Democrats
Hmm.
once again outspent the Republicans, but judicial races all went Democrat, and school board races in places like Bucks County, Pennsylvania, which used to be kind of the heart and soul of Republicans. If you're a Republican, with a pulse, you were going to win overwhelmingly in Bucks County, and they're losing
Mm.
school board races. And
Wow.
so I think Pennsylvania has become more like New York and less like Ohio. And again, I don't think it's a swing state anymore.
Huh.
One of the races I did, which
Wow.
was really interesting, and a long-term client, as they say, that I first met when I was in college, and he was elected to Philadelphia City Council in 1979. That was right after the Civil War.
Wow.
And he's been in office ever since because he does a really good job. But every couple cycles, they decide they're going to take him out. And this was a cycle they're trying to. And again, he's 72 now. So I think he was 24 when he was elected, 25 when he was elected. He was a kid. But they
It's got to
spent
be some sort of world record.
Yeah. And it's northeast part of very far northeast Philadelphia. And it's a plus. It's a plus 22 Democratic district registration, and it is a plus 64 vote by mail Democratic registration, and my candidate won by plus 23. And so if you were looking at that as a race, if you were looking at the odds of that, you would not have liked our odds. But there was no doubt we were going to win because, again, the fun part, again, of doing fantasy sports and the fun part about doing Fantasy Elect is that quality of candidate, quality of campaign, quality of consultants really matter. And I think it's going to be kind of fun is that as you kind of draft things, you draft and you look at research. And, when the Denver Broncos got Russell Wilson, everybody was like, they're going to go to the Super Bowl. Some professional coaches I know said, Russell Wilson can't play in that system,
Mm.
and he can't do it. Um, the very controversial Colin Kaepernick. I had a very smart
Mm.
football coach who um, probably has developed more Pro Bowl quarterbacks than anybody else in NFL history. Um,
Well,
said that he really liked Kaepernick as a quarterback, but the teams that needed a quarterback, Kaepernick couldn't play that system because
huh.
it was a different system. And basically it had to do with the kind of throws that Kaepernick can make and makes well and doesn't make well. And again, I mean
Right,
that's
right,
kind of
right.
like that's kind of the fun thing. But again, I mean, the Russell Wilson thing is, I think, a really good example of somebody that, like, you'd be like, fuck it, I'm drafting Russell Wilson, and he's been terrible. Um,
Right.
and I
Right.
think that the
It's
whole
more than
thing,
just knowing that somebody's a talented player, right? Like,
right? And again, and I think that if you're drafting in Fantasy Elect, it's not just looking at a name candidate in a state that you're familiar with. It's actually doing the
mm,
research and finding out, who you could win your league by, who the governor of Idaho is, and most people aren't
right.
thinking about the governor of
Definitely.
Idaho, but it's,
Yeah. No, you're right. I mean, the it's interesting that you brought up Pennsylvania. I wasn't tracking Pennsylvania. We've kind of jumped into 24. So playing this out a little bit, I was doing some reading through some reports today before this, and I I was thinking that two of the more interesting where money's going to be spent races would be the cinema race in Arizona.
yeah.
Like, where's the money going to flow in that race, right? I mean, that I think that that's a race that could easily flip to Republican.
Hmm.
Um, so where will the national money go? Where will it be, and who will raise that? I would assume that Cinema will raise quite strong. She's an incumbent. She has good ties. I think she'll raise a lot. Um, Gallardo's running against her, right? The representative. Will the Democrats pour money into Gallardo's campaign to unseat her? Um, and then the second campaign, I'm going to throw them both out, and then you can decide which one we talk about first. I was reading
You
about
just froze a
the
little bit.
Senate races in California. I'm sorry.
You froze. You said the second campaign. You froze.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the second campaign that I was looking at this morning that I think is interesting is the two Senate races in California. So I don't think I think the one that's interesting is the one that was Feinstein's seat. The replacement, I don't mean to be rude, but I don't remember her name. It hasn't been a long time. She's been
Yeah.
in office. Um, she's already said she's not going to run again. And you have Katie Porter and Adam Schiff. Adam Schiff was my rep when I was in
Oh, you're
LA.
freezing again.
Um,
Yep.
it's interesting. Um, oh, it says actual recording is higher quality. I think it might be recording on both ends, but we'll have
Okay.
to fix that. Um, so I was just saying that the really interesting race in California for me is what was Feinstein's seat. Do you have any thoughts on whether will the National Party support one or the other? Do you think? Do you think they're going to jump into that fight between Schiff and Katie Porter?
No, they'll stay out of that because they don't really, frankly, they don't give a rat's ass who it is. They just want the
Sure.
Democrat vote. They want the organizing vote. Cinema becomes more interesting, I think. I think the Democrats, he's going to have whatever, I think the best job this cycle coming up is going to be working for the super PAC for him, because it's going
Mm,
to be, $80 million. They're going to spend whatever it takes for that. And but what's interesting about the three party, I think, kind of going forward, is that you could have a presidential election with Biden, probably, with Trump, probably, with JFK, probably, with Jill Stein, probably, maybe with Joe Manchin and Mitt Romney ticket, maybe. and then Cornel West, maybe. And the fun part's going to be is that not all of them, let's assume they all run, because that's what we like. All of them will not be on in every state. And so it's going to be this mix and match. And, the presumption was that JFK Jr. hurts Joe Biden, but polling wise, he doesn't. He hurts Trump.
Mm-hmm.
He takes disaffected. He takes the FU vote away from Trump, and JFK Jr. Becomes the alternate outlet. Which is why if you look on Twitter, and again, look at what people do. Look at what campaigns do. And if you look at Twitter, the Trump campaign is now attacking JFK Jr. Jason Miller, who's a Trump spokesperson or a semi-Trump, he's attacking him for being a far left environmental kook, and because they see that JFK takes it. Conversely, I don't know that it's widely assumed that Manchin and a Manchin Romney ticket would hurt Biden. And I don't think that's the case at all. I think a Manchin Romney ticket hurts Trump. The conventional wisdom was back in 1992 that Ross Perot was going to hurt George Bush more than Bill Clinton. And he did slightly, but it was state dependent. In some states, Perot hurt Clinton more than Bush. And overall, Perot probably hurt Bush maybe by like a 3-2 pull down, but it was really state dependent. And so you have this really kind of lovely scenario where Joe Biden could win the Electoral College and Donald Trump could get the most votes. Because the states where...
That would be an interesting change.
Awesome.
That would be an interesting shift than the way it's been.
you would see people flip-flop on their long-held moral positions quicker than...
for sure. That might be the thing that keeps the Electoral College strong for another couple of generations. People are like, maybe this isn't such a bad idea.
No, you would be like, Democrats would be talking about the brilliance of the founding fathers, and Republicans be going, the will of the people, vox populi,
Right. But, exactly.
And again, I mean, the anarchist in me hopes that's the outcome. Just because I'd like to see that kind of chaos. I think it'd be fun just to watch people flip flop. But so that could be really interesting. And again, and so if you wanted to, if there are 5 major parties in the race and 5 major candidates in the race, how does it work out? You better get a big ass map, 50 states, and do it state by state, because that's the only way you're going to figure it out. Because there's going to be states, for instance, like South Dakota, which you think would be Republican, but have a strong populist independent tradition. And they might be vulnerable, to a Manchin candidacy. And so that would be really interesting. And by the way, this is nothing new in American politics. When I give my lectures on American political structure, is that we think of American politics as the Republicans are the conservative business party, the Democrats are the liberal Labor Party, because that has been true since the end of World War II. And since the end of World War II until roughly 2016, that was an incredibly stable and solid paradigm. And Republican candidates were either more conservative or less conservative, and Democratic candidates were either more liberal or less liberal, but they were all in this kind of very easy continuum. That's not the way it's been throughout the rest of American politics. I mean, that post-war era, that 50-war post-war era, that's the anomaly. For most of the rest of
Mm,
the country, American politics has been a shit show with multiple candidates and craziness and you know Democrats voting like what we consider Republicans and Republicans consider voting like Democrats and third parties, the
mm.
dissolution of major parties that just kind of vanish. Um, and so it's really been an interesting run. But this is kind of like we're getting past the boring part now, and we're kind of getting back to where the
Yeah.
action is and where the action has historically been in American politics. Um, you had Teddy Roosevelt's Bull Moose Party. You had Henry Wallace's Progressive Party in 1948 that almost cost Harry Truman the election. And
Mm,
if you look at
hmm.
1948, which essentially was still a war, not quite a war year, but it was right at that cusp. You had the Republican Party, Thomas Dewey, who was by anybody's math, a liberal reformer from fucking New York. You had Harry Truman, who was the Democrat incumbent from conservative Missouri, who just dropped the bomb,
Mm.
dropped multiple bombs. You had Henry Wallace, who was as progressive a figure in the 20th century that we had, was running. And then you had Strom Thurmond, who was running in the South as a states' rights Democrat. And so you had four
I
major
didn't
parties.
realize that that was the year.
Sorry, you froze.
Oh, I was just gonna say, wow, I didn't realize that 48 was the year that Thurman ran. I knew that he ran, but
Yep.
it seems like so long ago now. He's been gone for almost 20
Yep.
years now, I guess. But wow, yeah, and that is a packed race right there. And to your point, I mean, even for the Democrats and the Republicans as a party, those shifted, right? So
Yeah.
the lots of talk of like the party of Lincoln for the Republicans, that is true, right? The Republicans were the party of like the northern anti-slavery group, and then you had the Southern Democrat Party that was the party of I guess you could say slavery. I don't know if that was their founding principle, but that was who they were. And then there was a shift, I guess, around the 60s, right? When, Johnson basically said, I've lost the South. And there was a shift. And maybe even before that, it was changing, to your point. So, what I'm hearing is there's a lot of kind of in our politics, we might emotionally become very disconcerted that things aren't as stable as we thought they were, but it's really a reversion to the mean. American politics is a messy, uh, shifting alliances, shifting electorate voting habits that maybe traditionally and generally are not a reliable thing. You can't put them in parties as reliably as maybe we think we can based on the post-war experience that most of us have had, right?
Yeah, and if you think about it, it makes perfect sense because if you look at the end of the Civil War, if you go from there into this incredible period of turmoil where there were multiple parties popping up all over the place. I mean, I think you had six or seven
Mm.
black U.S. senators elected from the Deep South as Republicans in Reconstruction.
Wow.
And in if you go to uh, what we consider right now kind of the hardcore Republican place in places like Montana and the Dakotas, you had these incredible populists, and then you had the Know Nothing
Hmm.
Party, which was kind of this very populist immigration party, anti-immigration party. You had
Hmm.
Williams Jennings Bryan was the Democrat standard bearer who basically wanted to change the entire U.S. economy, and he was for the farmers against the Republican big city people. I mean, it keeps flipping and flopping,
Yeah.
and again, I think that's what makes it interesting. And if you're interested in politics, this is really the greatest time to be alive um, because the world's changing and it's
Yeah.
changing right out from under us. And one of the things that you see over and over again now, um, in about an hour or half an hour, I've got a conference I'm going to be on about Latino voters. And Latino voters are more and more voting Republican. and Democrats can't stop the bleed. And you also see African
Right.
Americans starting to vote Republican, and Democrats can't stop the bleed. You see college educated white people who in 2012 voted for Mitt Romney are now overwhelmingly and wholeheartedly Democrats, and Republicans can't stop the bleed. So literally
Right.
in the past decade, you're seeing this giant flip. And again, it's interesting. I mean, it's, basically a good thing when you're sports betting is you throw out your heart, and you use your brain. And that's a pretty good thing for political betting too. Forget how you feel
Yeah.
about it. Look at what's actually happening. And again, I mean, in 2012, white people voted for the Republican candidate for president. Or white college educated people voted for the Republican candidate for president. That hasn't happened
Right.
since, and it's not going to happen again for a while.
Right.
But Latinos voted overwhelmingly for the Democratic candidate, and my guess is in 24, they're going to vote for the Republican candidate. So it's kind of interesting.
It's so interesting, and it really plays. The last thing I'll say about this, if you want, we can kind of go to the social media aspect. But the last thing I would just add is that within the game, as we've set it up, you're drafting individuals. You're not required to do a specific party, very much like fantasy, right? So you can be a Cowboys fan. You might even be a fan of the NFC or the AFC, but you're selecting across boundaries to try to put the best team together. So to the point is that these ideas of specific groups and specific like requirements to be in one group or the other, it's all kind of falling away. So now as you're building your team, what you're really trying to identify is that those shifts, if you can identify where they are happening most pronounced in the next cycle and make
Mm-hmm.
really strategic draft choices, and it likely won't be with the big names initially. It'll be kind of in those, like you said, who tracks Montana really, right? But if you are tracking that, you might actually really rack up some fantasy points and win the prize pot by being smart with who you're drafting and knowing those trends and paying attention to those trends.
Yeah,
So I guess that's
absolutely. And yeah, I mean, the a hockey fantasy league that I played in, I got a low draft position, and so all the top players were gone, but I kind of did well in the league because we also pointed stuff like hits and fights and penalty minutes and crap like that. And so you draft a bunch of those things, and you can stay competitive without superstars. Um, so again, but I think I think the fun part about playing Fantasy Elect is that you're going to be a lot smarter about politics after you play once, because you're going to see the world in a different way, because you're going to see less good guys and bad guys and more levers of history. And you're going to have to be, to succeed, I think, you're going to have to be a sociologist, an anthropologist, and a clairvoyant. And that's, and that's fun.
And hopefully, I think that's actually a really good thing. I mean, people might hate us for destroying their illusions, but I think once they see the reality that you've experienced in a career of really seeing the reality of it, I think it actually serves them. It becomes not such a horrible experience, right? I mean, maybe you're starting to
Mhm.
have fewer arguments with family and friends around the Thanksgiving dinner table coming up, and instead you're having these debates over fantasy points last week, right? Um,
Yeah.
and you're making the experience of it a way more positive experience, and also, to your point, a more nuanced and clear-eyed view of politics, so that you also are getting your interests met as you exercise your civic rights and voting and everything else. You look at things differently. So I think that's a really good point. Um, The one thing I wanted to add,
Let-
because of time wise, oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, so to your point exactly. So I had a bunch of Democrat friends who were non-consultants, and they were like, "Oh, Joe Manchin's retiring. That's great. He needs to go. He needs to get out." No, 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 no. And I'm like, I said, you're going to get a pro-life, super duper conservative Republican that's going to vote against everything Biden does to replace him. You understand that, right? So you were pissed off at Manchin because he voted with Biden like 90% of the time. And now you're going to get somebody that votes against him 100% of the time. And I'm sorry, Manchin voted for Biden 90% of the time. And now you're going to get somebody that votes against Biden 100% of the time. So congratulations on the big fucking win, Yeah. And I think that
100%.
if you're playing a game, if you're playing a fantasy elect thing, that kind of reality is going to dawn on you really quickly.
For sure. I mean, Manchin was actually he was the defensive flank that never got any appreciation. I mean, in West Virginia, and again, even Republicans were saying it. He votes along with the Democrats 99% of the time, 90-something% of the time. He was a reliable ally. He just was he came from a different cultural perspective and maybe didn't phrase things in a way, but he was an ally, maybe viewed imperfectly by others in the party, but a reliable ally. That's really great. Okay, so one thing that we talked about doing was engaging with social media. We don't have nobody's tweeted us yet their questions, but we do want to eventually open it up to questions from listeners and stuff like that. I did see a tweet that about the Mark Wayne from Oklahoma almost got into a fight with the head of the union. Was it the AFL-CIO? I think. No, it's Teamsters. I think. Yeah. So I thought, let's talk about that, because the senator, I guess, was from MMA, so he's an athlete. He's sports is related there.
He's jacked.
Interest. Yeah. I mean, I can understand why the fight. It was a good thing that the fight didn't happen. I was kind of laughing out loud as I was listening to some talking heads talking about how Bernie Sanders said, this is, you're a senator, act like it. And I saw an interview with Hannity and the senator, and Hannity just said, I don't think this is going to hurt you back home. So this is the point. Does this event, how much does this bump his raising back home in Oklahoma? This kind of event?
It's a good question. I think it helps him, but it might be a sugar high. What really helps candidates are events like that if they've got a substantive record. And you kind of go, damn right, that's the guy fighting for me. Ha ha ha, big personality. I think that if you become the clown that always it's a trick he can do once, and he just pulled the trick. I mean, apparently him and the Teamster guy had a history, and so I think if you do that, I think that's fine and good, but he can't do that again, or else he becomes that asshole that has steroid brains, and so I think it helps him short term. Long term, I think he kind of took a card out of his hand. Especially because he was holding on. Here's the mean things you tweeted. Here's the mean things you tweeted about me. Well, stop.
Yeah.
As opposed to being As opposed to being indignant to somebody at the EPA or the Department of Justice or the IRS to say, you fucked my constituents and you fucked these working people, and push them. And if they responded, you'd be like, you want to take it outside? We'll do that right now. That would be a huge help because that makes him a fighter for people. This made him a theatrical fighter for himself.
Well, that's a very interesting take. I didn't think about it that way, but that is a really interesting take. I mean, it did kind of jump out at me. I didn't think about it. He's reading all these tweets about him. I guess I've never had anybody tweet at me negatively, so I don't know what it feels like, but it did seem a little bit like, okay, well, it's a tweet, like,
Right.
That's a really interesting take. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, I think people respond really well when you get angry on their behalf. But when you get angry about something that seems rather insignificant to them personally. All right, so there might be a sugar high bump in his fundraising, but don't necessarily think that that's going to correlate to any kind of long-term success.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too is that he picked on a guy. I don't even know who some kind of Teamster dude who, I mean, it wasn't like he picked on somebody insignificant. I mean, it's like,
right.
It's like beating the Giants next week and trash talking the Giants. Right. Yeah, okay, great, that's terrific, right?
Oh, the poor Giants. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Chris, this has been awesome. I don't know if other people have, I don't know what it'll be and we'll evolve over time. I had a blast. I think I did want to give a shout out. I wanted you to know. So we've had several winners on the platform. You're going to like this name.
Nice.
One is, I'm going to conservatarian, like vegetarian.
Vegetarian.
So I don't know if that means that. Yeah. So I don't know if this means this player doesn't like conservatives, so like they only eat conservatives, or if they are conservative and they like dominate and eat everybody else. I don't know which way that goes, but conservatarian was the name I wanted to share with you. Some of the other names, they aren't as witty and fun. Right. But yeah, we've had several winners, and we have one game left open for Saturday for the Louisiana general election. We'll see how who wins that. That's a $100 prize pot, I think. So we've already paid out, several hundreds, maybe thousands of dollars in prizes, and preparing now to take on games for next year. So,
excellent,
Chris. It's been awesome. Let's do it again next week. And
absolutely,
and thank you. Anything you want to say at the end?
No, I think the Eastern admonition, may you live in, which is the curse, may you live in interesting times.
Yeah. May you win large prize pots while living in interesting times.
Interesting times, yeah. Maybe that's the name of the podcast.
That's interesting. Yeah.
All right, man.
Large prizes and interesting times.
Yeah.
All right, I'll talk to you soon. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Justin.